Welcome back to Garden Studio. I'm Tessa Pinner, a designer and gardener in upstate South Carolina, Zone 8A. Sometimes what we really need more than anything else is to catch a vision and be inspired. That's how I was feeling on this cold winter day, and maybe you're not watching this in the winter. It could be true any day of the year. When I think of inspiring garden places, I always think of England. In 2019, I had the immense privilege of spending a summer working as a gardener at Great Dixter, one of England's great public gardens. My time there forever changed how I see gardens and gardening, and I left with a burning desire to figure out how to translate the magic of English gardens to my home setting. It's been a few years, but honestly, that magic has not faded in my mind. I'm still just as inspired now as I was when I was there working. As I've thought about what exactly makes up that magic, I keep coming back to three big ideas. The first big idea that comes to mind is the character and emotion of the garden spaces. And this is for a host of different reasons. One of which is that the garden is broken up into different spaces. So you have themed areas and different light exposures and different functions. And all of those give this varied human experience to the garden as you travel around. It's almost like going on an adventure, or I've heard it described as garden theater, where you're having all of these different, very strong experiences as you tour through the garden. When I think of Great Dixter, I think how the garden made me feel, which was in turn peaceful, excited, just full of wonder is probably the biggest one. All of the incredibly abundant planting, tight pathways, surprises around every corner. It all added up to this incredible dynamic experience. Another component of this is, to me, the idea of charm, and the fact that charm is not found in perfection. For a garden that has an incredible staff of full-time horticulturists, an army of volunteers, and then even seasonal workers like I was, it still isn't perfect. The paths are uneven, and the stones might be chipped, and the walls might be leaning, and the house is crooked. If you look at the front of the house, you think, how can that still be standing up? This Tudor structure is leaning, and all of that doesn't make it less amazing. It actually makes it better. I found that people in the States are always very worried that a garden path be wide enough. And I think it's so funny because part of the visceral experience of a garden is having the plants touch you. I think we're also used to public parks where things are miles away, but at Great Dixter, there is no escaping the plants. The paths are tight. The plants are so lush that you're going to walk by something and it is going to touch you. There is so much charm in all of the handmade pieces around the garden. The benches are handmade. The hurdles are handmade. Any of the plant supports are handmade. There isn't this culture of go out and spend the highest dollar on the furniture or on the structures or even on the pots. They also deal with many of the same pressures that we do. All of the fruit was grown in a giant cage, essentially, because of the wildlife, and the deer would eat everything if it was out exposed in the garden. Peter Rabbit is alive and well in England. The man who first made the garden at Great Dixter is named Christopher Lloyd, and he was a very famous garden writer and columnist. People love to talk about how Christopher Lloyd's spirit is still in the garden. Because a garden is not a natural wild space, it is a creation by a gardener. It does reflect that gardener's personality and preferences and style. That is really powerful. The curiosity and the experimentation that Christopher Lloyd brought to the garden has spawned this spirit of continuing experimentation in the staff. The current head gardener, Fergus Garrett, is very well known and respected for continuing innovation at the garden. Of course, my garden does not look like Great Dixter, but the hope is that it could look like me, and your garden could look like you. It could reflect what you love, it could reflect your priorities, and hopefully, if you pour enough love and time and energy into it, people will enter the garden and say, there is something special here. My second big takeaway is the importance of diversity and abundance in planting. Depending on where you are, this may look nothing like English gardening, but the principle of having a garden be an exceptionally diverse and abundant space is very powerful. During the time I was in residence at the garden, they were doing part of an ongoing diversity study, and the portion that was happening was the moth counts. So they would put up these huge box lights in the garden at night and then count and identify the species of moths that were coming to those lights. They did counts and studies with butterflies, with bees of all types, other bugs, other invertebrates. And what they found after this comprehensive and ongoing study is that the garden was absolutely a hotspot for ecological diversity. There were species found in it that were not found in the surrounding countryside. There were quantities and densities found there because of the plants, because it could support that much life. That's a huge encouragement to me as a gardener that no, we cannot create a wild space. In most cases, our goal shouldn't be to do so because we've already come to inhabit disturbed land. There is very little that is truly wild. The thing that is in our power is to create gardens that function well ecologically, that provide food sources, that provide shelter, that provide nectar and pollen and berries. In the case of a garden like Great Dixter, it's not an all-native garden by any means. There's lots of tropical and exotic species in the garden. And what they found was that didn't matter. Even the non-native plants provided many valuable services in the garden. The final principle that I've kept coming back to over the last 5 years is just one of enjoyment. All of the people that I met, both gardeners and just people coming to visit the gardens, not necessarily the bus of tourists, but just average people, average British people coming to visit the gardens, was how much gardening is part of the cultural lifestyle in Britain. And there is a generational heritage and love for gardening. It's not in the category of niche hobby like it is here. Most people that I know in the United States view gardening one of two ways. One, it is either strictly useful. So this would be, yes, I have a garden. I grow my tomatoes, I grow my cucumbers, and I grow peppers. And then I can them all, and that's my garden for the year. Or they view it as a thing that someone else does, something you pay somebody to do. And they would call it landscape or landscape maintenance. So, oh yeah, have a yard guy would be a very common way to express it here. There isn't any personal involvement or really joy or knowledge there. And that's not an indictment. I believe truly that that's a very cultural thing that we've inherited. And I think it's sad. Because going to England, I see what it could be instead, where there's grandmothers gardening and there are people who leave the office and they go to their allotment and they garden because it's a source of joy and life for them. And then there's little kids out in the garden. When someone renovates a country house, it's a given that they're going to hire a garden designer and they're going to prioritize the garden. It is pretty funny here. In all of my experience of design and construction, it seems like the garden is always the last thing, both on the construction schedule and on the list of priorities. There are checklists of you need 2 trees and you need 10 shrubs and there must not be more than X amount of empty mulch, or you can't have any just dirt showing. There's these kind of checklist guidelines that make landscape into a formula, into a box to be ticked. And it's just not that way in England. And I would argue when it is that way, there is just absolutely no joy in it. I truly wish you all could go visit Great Dixter in person. And if you ever have the chance, you had better go, because it is phenomenal. It will change how you see your own garden and the potential there. I personally cannot wait to go back. I hope you enjoyed these beautiful pictures and videos. I certainly feel more inspired after that. And I hope you have a wonderful week in your own gardens. Happy gardening.